Okay, welcome everyone to today's TDG. I'll just do an acknowledgement of country to kick off. We acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we all gather today. We pay our respects to our elders past, present and emerging, and extend our respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. We acknowledge the First Peoples as the first scientists, educators and healers. So the agenda today, we've got Kylie here who's just going to give us a quick update straight away on the AUCDI. She's got to jump off to another meeting, so we'll go straight into that update from her. Then all our usual business, and we'll be revisiting some of the discussions from the last TDG, going through the diagnostic request supporting info on clinical context and the approach to implementing supporting info. And then the focus will be on what's next in the lead up to ballot, which is not that far away. So we're going to talk about the approach and how many meetings we've got and what we're going to get through in those meetings. So that's for the second half of the session. So Kylie, I might get you to jump straight into the AUCDI update.
Thanks, Michael. So AUCDI R2 is currently on track to be published in June 2025. So AUCDI R2 will be a compilation of all of the content from AUCDI R1, plus the content from the patient summary component and the chronic condition management component. For R2, we're really looking to, now that I guess where we're at now, we decided to try and kind of focus the content more around the data group library. And so a lot of the introductory explanatory material will be moved to the website. I think we've now got about 40 data groups, so it's like quite a large compilation. So we're really focusing AUCDI to just have that and really pull out a lot of the extra content. So when it comes out in June, you'll notice that there's a bit of a change there. We received across the two components, the patient summary and the chronic condition management, we did receive over 500 lines of feedback. So thank you to everyone who provided feedback. That feedback, we've kind of updated bits and pieces of the AUCDI R2 content as made sense. And we'll be publishing all the feedback and the responses on the website when the document is published as well. Next slide two. Next slide. So we are, with this new release, we are looking at how AUCDI is maturing from this idea of core of the core, use case being use case agnostic and really setting the foundation in release 1. And in release 2, we've moved to add additional use cases. So we've expanded from that idea of core of the core and included patient summary and chronic condition management. So with that, if you just go to the next slide, we are looking to change the name of AUCDI from Australian Core Data for Interoperability to Australian Clinical Data for Interoperability. So keeping the same acronym, but kind of moving a little bit away from the word core, and kind of using a different word, so clinical there. So for next slide. So because AUCDI, it contains more than just core content. It's the release 1, but it's also the patient summary and chronic condition management. And then if you hit next, that means that in R3, we'll be able to include anything in AUCDI R2, any additional use cases and content that's required of us. And we're looking to then fold in the AU eRequesting DI R1 into AUCDI. So for AUCDI R2, for the chronic condition management component, we already have we are already putting in the service request because that's required for requests and referrals. But in R3, we'll look to fold in the rest of the AU eRecDI content. Next slide. So within AUCDI, we would then need to identify the data groups and data elements specific to their clinical use cases or their use cases. So whether it's core, patient summary, chronic condition management, and then eRequesting in R3, and acknowledging that data groups and data elements can have multiple use cases identified. And then last slide, I think. What we see the benefits for this is that all our clinical use cases will be in one place. It'll make it simpler to find, and it does demonstrate that reuse of the data groups. We wanted to make it clear that it builds on that clinical community of practice that's developed AUCDI to expand that scope beyond that core. to additional use cases, but still allowing the TDGs to easily identify the data groups and elements in scope for those different specific use cases. It also gives us room to grow and add additional clinical use cases and data requirements beyond that core of the core. I think that's all I had. And I don't know if there was any questions.
Thanks, Colleen. Are there any questions while we've got Colleen here on AUCDI moving forward? So any questions? But you can always reach out to Colleen if you do have questions as they come up. And we'll keep an eye on that R2 coming out. Thanks, Colleen.
Thanks, Michael. Thanks, everyone.
We can now jump into our usual business. We just had to go through that as Colleen had to go to another meeting. But we'll go through our usual business. First of all is the approval of minutes from last fortnight. So this was in between Easter and Anzac Day. I'll just try and find this is the minutes. So Chris and Angus did a great job running this meeting. So there's a couple of points in here to note in these minutes. So there was a straw poll that was done, and then a motion that was actually to move that we use observation resource to represent clinical context. And that was successful. So we didn't have a lot of people in this meeting, but that motion was successful. It was a successful motion. We had a majority. Then there was some further discussion about whether it might need to be taken to the broader group, given that it was a small meeting, there wasn't many in attendance, and it was fairly close on the sort of straw poll, sort of nearly 50-50. I think it was a slight winner to observation. Whether that should be brought back to the broader group in this meeting, whether we have more attendees. So there was a second motion then made to reverse the original decision so that it could come back to this meeting. And there was some confusion about what was actually required in that and whether it was classified as a revisit. And our thought was that if there was a revisit of a previous decision, that there needed to be an 80% majority. And it was calculated that there was only a 64% majority, and therefore in the meeting it was understood that had failed. But as it turns out, that was actually successful. So one point of note there is that abstains don't count in the percentage. So there was 9 affirmative and there was 2 negative, which actually gave an 81% majority. The other note is about whether it was actually required as a revisit or not. So I just wanted to go through that quickly. Should get back to this, the next slide. So this is out of the HL7 AU decision-making practices and talks about revisiting TDG decisions. So what it does is it recognises that revisiting previously decisions inhibits progress and should be discouraged. That said, circumstances might exist that warrant reopening discussions that were previously resolved. So it says to dissuade this practice, such reopening requires a formal motion, a second, and 2/3. So it was a 66% majority, not an 80% majority that was believed in that meeting. And for the decision to be revisited, a previous decision to be considered binding, advance notification is required. And this advance notification can be waived to expedite ballot if items in the group determines when new discussions represent the same range of views addressed in the original. So I think given that the decisions were both made in the same meeting, I'm not sure that it actually qualifies as a revisit, given the group further discussed it after making the original decision in the same meeting. Made another decision to override that. But either way, there ended up being 81% majority. So whether it's classified as a revisit or not, it's still passed. So that was a point of note for those minutes. It was believed in the time that the motion had failed, but it had actually passed. So we will go through that discussion and vote again in this meeting today. Does anyone have any questions on that or any other comments on the minutes from that meeting? Is everyone happy with the way that that ended up? If there are no other comments, does anyone want a motion to accept
I'll
these
move the
minutes?
minutes. Michael Osborne.
Thanks, Michael. Do I have a second? Anyone?
I'll second it.
Okay, thanks, Angus. I will launch a poll for that. So previous minutes. You should see that now. So we'll probably have a number. Please abstain if you haven't looked at it or weren't at the meeting. We should have a number of you doing that, given it was a smaller meeting. One affirmative addition in the chat from Steph. I think we've got the majority of people participate. I know there's a number of AI bots in this meeting, so they're not going to work. So I'll end that now in 3, 2, 1. So that has passed. We have 13 affirmative plus 1 in the chat, so 14 affirmative, 0 negative, and 13 abstained. So that motion has passed. Okay. Action items. We've the first action item there, the harmonisation group is still being set up, so there's no additional updates for that one. I wonder if we've got Joy or Ruben on the call to provide any updates on the other action items. Can't see participants. Doesn't look like it. So we'll have to follow those up. We'll continue to follow those up. So there's apologies from Joy. So, and I can't see you in here. No. So we'll have to, they're still outstanding there, and we'll have to follow that up. Okay. Now this is the Spark testing event that we've got planned for 24th of June. This is a registration form to participate in that. The registrations do close tomorrow. There's only a couple of tickets left. So if you do want to attend this in Brisbane and test eRequesting, which will be very close to our ballot snapshot, so doing final tests to make sure that it is fit for purpose. We definitely encourage you to come along and test your products with the latest version of eRequesting. Like I said, this does close tomorrow and there's only a couple of tickets left. So please jump on that now if you can. I will just paste the link in the chat if you can't use the QR code once I get it. So it only takes a few minutes to fill in. So if you do want to come, please fill in that now so you can come along. The other update is that we've become aware of an international IG that is going to ballot, which is called the Clinical Order Workflow IG, or COW. And there are potentially some things we need to look at in this on whether we align eRequesting to it or provide feedback to that ballot, things that we're doing that you think should be in COW. So I'll copy the links for that into the chat as well. I'd recommend that anyone who's interested in TDG should have a look at this IG. Just put that in the chat. Also created, I've done an initial pass of this, just created a eRequesting Confluence page, which is some things that I sort of pulled out of it and thought might be relevant for the TDG. I'll put this in the chat as well. Definitely encourage you to have a read of the Clinical Order Workflow IG and contribute to this page. So these are things that we might want to consider, things that have been mentioned, things that might be different, things we haven't thought of, those sorts of things. This is really just an open discussion page. Everyone is welcome to contribute to this page. And we can use that to see if there's anything we should potentially be doing differently in eRequesting to align with this, or provide feedback back to this IG where we want them to align with some of the things we're doing. It's a good read, have a look, contribute to the page. And if there's anything we find, I think we can raise some Jira issues against eRequesting and potentially look to address them through TDG. But at the moment, it's just something to have a look at and consideration for eRequesting. Okay, back in the clinical context feature discussion. So this is the one that was held. Angus took us through it in the last meeting. And I think now I've got the broader group here. We just want to revisit this. So we're not going to go through, I don't think, all the detail we went through last time, but I'll let Angus run through it. So we've got the continuity because I wasn't at the last meeting. And we'll see if we can get to a decision on the outcome we want for this. Angus, you just happy you just tell me when you want another screen, or you want me to just jump ahead a bit?
Yeah, you drive.
Yep.
So where were we? Okay, so we were making two. So sorry, can you just go to the next slide? I'll just get my bearings for where we're going. Right. Oh yeah. Yep. Go back. So as per 2 weeks ago. So the first thing we're looking at is the clinical context, which in eRequesting is often called clinical notes. So it's usually a text box on paper forms where the doctor, they're called clinical notes, and they can write stuff in there. They tend to write all sorts of crimes in there, but the intent is clinical notes. This is the AU eReqDI's description of this content. So they want the data type of string. It's optional. It's a single occurrence for the entire request. And this is data element that describes the broader clinical background and circumstances related to the request, supporting the service provider in making informed decisions about the service delivery. Historically, many paper forms feature a section labeled clinical notes to determine relevant background content for each service request. This data element has been purposefully named clinical context to semantically differentiate it from the more generic comment, which allows clinicians to record any additional information not captured in semantically specific data elements. So that's what the clinical group has given us, the sort of mandate of what they're looking for. So should we go to the next slide, Michael? So we were then trying to work out what FHIR resource would this fit into nicely? Where should we put it for eRequesting? So a couple of options were thrown up. So one was to have a document reference resource, which kind of points to another document, but in our case, it would just point to the content of a string, which is the clinical context or clinical notes. Another option was an observation, use a FHIR observation resource, have a code like referral note, and then have the data type provided as a string, and that's where the clinical note would be stored. And the third option was clinical impression, which is another FHIR resource, but I think we've talked about this a few times, that we've kind of reached a position where majority of us think that clinical impression is not a good fit. It's just doesn't really fit the use case we have, even though it sort of sounds like it does. But encourage people to go read the description in the FHIR resource. But that was the third option. On Confluence, there's a whole discussion in there about these resources that sort of digs into each of them. Here it is. So yeah, put that in the chat. Probably good for people to skim through that. Yeah, go back to the slides maybe. I'm trying to go a little bit faster, given we went all through this last time. So we've had this sort of pros and cons comparison of those three resources, document reference, observation, clinical impression. As you can see on the right, clinical impression is hitting a lot of the red crosses where it doesn't really suit, but I feel a lot of the tussle is between document reference and observation. So fit for unstructured clinical narrative, document reference is a good choice for encapsulating clinical narratives such as clinical context, referral notes, doesn't say why. Observations representing clinical narratives using an observation resource appears semantically inappropriate given the defined scope and intent usage of observation resources, is someone's opinion. Resource supports categorization of clinical note types. Resource supports. So can you categorize them? So inherently supports FHIR document codes binding to, so you can put a code on it called referral note on that document type, being the potential candidate for clinical context. Separation from other supporting information like pregnancy status, modeled as an observation, which is important for deduplication of common supporting information. And then on the right, they're saying for observation, the preferred terminology binding for observation category does not provide a suitable code to identify the instance of a clinical note. So that category code tends to be things like chemistry or hematology or imaging. So they're sort of saying there isn't really a category code that fits across referral note or clinical notes. It is possible to use the same code as we're using on the left, referral note, in observation code to indicate that the instance represents a clinical note. So the category could, I'm not sure if category is optional, maybe that can be left out. So there's that comparison. Ease of implementation. So overhead in managing plain text clinical notes as base 64 encoding coded content or links. So with document reference, if we're not actually going to point to another resource, which is the document, like a PDF or a Word document or an Excel spreadsheet, if we're just doing plain text and inlining it in the document reference, then it must be base 64 encoded. For the end users, this is of no concern. It's just a way that we technically pack the text into the resource. From an implementer's point of view, it's a slight annoyance because you can't just read the text in the clinical note without having to unbase 64 encode it. So the reason it's base 64 encoded is because document reference could point to other things that aren't just strings, like an Excel spreadsheet or a PDF. And in that case, it's binary data, therefore it has to be base 64 encoded. Here, we just inherit the fact that we have to base 64 encode it because it has to support those other document types, even though we are only going to put string in there. So that's that kind of point. On the right-hand side for observation, it's a little simpler for the implementers at least, because it literally is just plain text. So from the programmer, people have to look at these things. On the right-hand side, you could literally see the clinical note. On the left-hand side, you'd have to run it through a tool to see the clinical note. Support for multiple formats. So on the left, document reference supports various attachment formats. However, it may need to be constrained for eRequesting, as any MIME type can be exchanged. So what they're saying there is, unless we constrain it, they could put all sorts of things there, like images and PDFs and Excel sheets, but we would look to constrain it to say, no, it must only be text. On the right-hand side, support for attachments using, so I suppose the point on the left is you could expand it in the future. So we could make the choice on the left today, set it to string, but tomorrow, next year, down the road, when someone says, oh, I want to send you a PDF or a Word document, we could quite easily just expand the allowable content. On the right-hand side, observations in R4 don't support attachments, but in R5 they do. So we could certainly bring the R5 back as an extension. So you could add that capability to observation, but natively today in R4, there is no option for attachments, but it could be added and be aligned going forward. Alignment with other IGs. So the use of document reference for clinical notes does align with existing approaches for clinical exchange notes to US Core. So US Core uses that approach. On the right, US Core does not use observations, so there is no other IG doing observations for clinical notes. And extensible for eRequesting. extensibility for eRequesting can be profiled to constrain and support document formats as needed, i.e. support only text plain now and then support other MIME types like PDF and JPEGs in the future. On the right, they're saying limited extensibility for document-like use. So observation wouldn't be a great candidate to put a PDF in, or it's great for text, but probably not great for PDFs and JPEGs. And we're kind of, I won't go through the clinical impressions, but you can see they're all red, 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 red. There's not a lot of going for clinical impression. Next slide, Michael.
I think that's kind of it. I think what we're going to do next is do a poll, right? So it was probably, I've got a poll that I can launch that will get the indication of which is the preference. So it's probably more opening up to discussion now on the options and preferences, or more detail where people are unsure what some of this might mean, or have some thoughts or comments on it. So I think we can probably open the floor to anyone who would like to comment on either option.
I guess I'll make a comment. I will say that whilst there are these negatives against observation because it doesn't support other document types, that's not to say document reference couldn't be used in the future where you need to support other document types. So yes, it's not a great fit for PDFs and Excels and JPEGs, and I wouldn't propose using observation for those. But when the day comes that you do want to send those things, you can bring in document reference. So, I'm obviously leaning towards observation, but I lean that way purely for simplicity. It's a simple solution to the problem, where the one on the left is a more complicated solution to the problem, but it does, has more support going forward.
I agree with Angus. I think document reference is more complicated hammer to hit things with. The fitting clinical notes in with our existing work with observations would just be much cleaner. That's probably the way we'd go in our implementation. If we needed in future to have a second class of this, which had other characteristics to it, we can certainly extend through a different observation category to cover that. And I don't think that the lack of attachments is a issue, given we have seen that emerge in the R5 observation anyway. So we would certainly be easily aligned to that R5 option in future.
And I think if we wanted attachments, if we want to say, oh, now you can, attach an image to your request, then when that day comes, we use document reference to attach that image.
I'd be interested on the counter of that about the deviation from the standard approach to clinical notes, given the US core guidance on clinical notes. And if you were to implement clinical notes against their encounter and the like, you would be using document reference. That the sort of standardized approach to use of document reference for clinical notes, whether there's any concern about deviating from that for our use of clinical notes.
Can I just ask a question? Are the US clinical notes different to what we're proposing for the Australian ones in terms of it being plain text only?
No, it's a generic, so it is clinical notes across any exchange. It's not specific to service request.
Is it constrained to text only, Michael?
No, it is not either.
Yeah.
No, but I mean, that's where similar to in AU Core, where you then constrain it for your specific use case, right? So I think that they are the two main arguments, right? Is our use case at the moment is plain text only. That's our use case, but it is a clinical note. And whether we're going to the side that's more simple to implement our plain text, or going with a more standardized approach to clinical notes, which is much more complex. So, but more standard.
I don't think it's necessarily accurate to say it's more standardized. That there already is clinical notes in a service request, full stop. Like we're already deviating from the standard by attempting to do this shared clinical note. And so it's not the standard way of doing clinical notes for service requests currently. But we also, while I agree that the US is an interesting reflection, I don't think the US core is our standard, and that certainly the politics of HL7 International and the US's role in that going forward is, I don't think, as it was a year ago. So I do think that we have an opportunity to, see through our own future, and we will already be using those observations for a range of purposes to support the service request. The US doesn't carry the same grouping kind of foundation that we do. And it's, again, I guess, a reason why I don't actually agree with a lot of the COW decisions that were made in terms of how they're looking to support even things like modifications and stuff. But that's beside the point.
Can we just have a quick look at the US core clinical notes, just to, you're probably right, we don't have to follow it, right? It's not something we have to, just, well, yeah. Yeah, so this implementation guide, clinical note, refers to a wide variety of documents generated on behalf of a patient in many care activities. They include notes to support transitions of care, care planning, quality reporting, billing, and even handwritten notes for providers. And then this implementation code defines how system exchange common clinical notes and free diagnostics. So this talks all about the relationship with diagnostic reports as well. It talks about the different types of clinical notes that they might have in US core. And this is the one we're potentially looking at as referral note. Talks about the distinction between a diagnostic report and a document reference and what crossover there is. And again, this talks about them referencing the same diagnostic request. So, yeah, like I said, we don't have to follow this. Just was interested if anyone did have any particular thoughts about, from an implementer point of view, whether aligning this makes things easier, harder. Steph.
Yeah, just to bring up something that was presented at recent eHealth Research Centre seminar on using AI to help produce chest X-ray reports using supporting patient data. Anyway, some key insights from that paper that was presented was that they actually used the phrase clinical context, and the things that they found that statistically improved the report generation of their models were like triage notes, medication history, referral reasons and medical history, and interestingly, prior chest X-ray reports, so previous studies. So for me, it kind of confirmed that the clinical value in, the value in the additional clinical context, the supporting information in support of these diagnostic requests, and the broad nature of clinical context supports the use of document reference. If we were to model all of those things as observations, to me, it seems a little bit wonky. But yeah, keen to hear other people's thoughts on that.
It
I don't
sounds
think
like
we've-
a very interesting academic observation, but like in terms
Um,
of the reality of implementation, like that's just it's
it
adding a burden to a whole bunch of development that I just don't understand the return on investment for that at the moment.
it it wasn't. I will say that what was presented, it was the study was motivated by the observation that radiologists are more confident in reporting their findings and impressions when provided with clinical context. So to
I
me,
don't think
it
we're
seemed
saying,
purely
we're
academic.
not saying don't provide clinical context. We're only really talking about what form are we going to put that clinical context in to carry it with us. We know we're not going to be in a position to necessarily support every piece of clinical context that anyone can think of. We have issues where if as a placer you include clinical context that actually cannot be processed at the filler, then that can create a clinical issue. So, the whole focus of this was on text notes and how do we carry text notes. So it's not, I don't think we're necessarily talking about the broader nature of clinical context. I think it's a very focused issue that we're looking to resolve around this. If we were truly trying to solve the broader representation of, everything from a image to previous studies to all sorts of things, that's a whole other discussion.
Just
Mentioned
a-
AI. I wonder how AI deals with the base 64 text in the resource if you were going to run AI over FHIR resources. It's a long shot, but is AI going to dbase 64 encode it and understand that clinical note?
AI understands everything.
It does understand everything, can do everything. I don't know why we're making a standard, really.
Yeah, it's just Neil's narrative.
The one I'm coming back to is on an encounter, if you have a clinical note, you would be creating a document reference. And therefore, if you're creating a clinical context against this, you would have a different approach to create that clinical note, even though the source system may be doing the same approach.
But if that encounters clinical note is a Word document, then it ain't going to work anyway, is it?
No, that's right. I'm just talking about from a system point of view. Is I'm creating a clinical note. There might be constraints. Ours has to be constrained. I don't think there's any doubt. But release one, it's constrained to plain text. Yeah, I think both options give us extensibility, right? That we're not stuck with plain text for the future, right? If we want to go a different way. But we would definitely be starting with plain text and be constrained to plain text. It's just whether from having different ways in a system to create clinical notes for different resources, whether that's a problem or not. Right? I'm not saying it is. It's just something to consider whether using approach you might use clinical notes elsewhere is worthy or not.
I see this as this all goes in supporting information for the service request, right? So whether it's the pregnancy status supporting information, this clinical notes, or anything, and as a receiver of this data, I have to be able to understand all supporting information. I can't just go, I don't know what that is, I'll just ignore it, right? For the reasons Andy said, it's a clinical risk. If you're telling me something in this request, I have to be able to handle it, right? Otherwise, I have to reject your whole order, right? Because otherwise it's a clinical risk. So if in the future, we want to send clinical notes in a Word document, then we can add document reference to supporting information, and it can be called referral note, and it can have that Word document in it, and I'm going to have to support it, right? It doesn't matter if in the future there's an observation of referral note, which is text, and there's a document reference of referral note, which is a Word document. If that Word document's now in play and I have to support it, I have to support both, right? So here's some text supporting information. Here's a Word document supporting information. Here's an image supporting information, right? So even going forward, the fact that we might put the text referral note in an observation today does not block me in the future from maybe that referral note's in a Word document tomorrow, and I am now forced to handle Word documents, right? So, you know, are we going to say in the future that when the Word document comes in that we're now going to disallow the text observation? I don't think so.
Yeah.
Like, so really anything we add to supporting information, no matter what it is, has to be supported by the receiving systems. And over time, you can add more and more and more in there as long as you coordinate industry to be able to support those things. So this decision here doesn't block you in the future from sending JPEGs and Word documents. What blocks you is the industry being able to support that content, right?
Correct. I don't think we'll end up in the same place with either of these options, right? Neither of them are going to constrain the solution or the future, right? It's just, is one a better choice than the other for now and the future, right? I think they're both viable choices, right? And which is the best choice, right? So, and that's what we're here to try and determine, I think. Dan?
Wondering if you could share with us the observation resource and go through its scope and usage, and that might help clarify in people's minds what it could and shouldn't be used for.
Yep. Bring that up. So we'll just start with the definitions here. It's the measurement and simple assertions made about a patient, device, or other subject. Use support diagnostics, monitoring progress, determining baselines, patterns, and even capture demographic characteristics. Most observations simple name value pair, some metadata, but some observations group scale observations logically. So let's just have a look at what's here.
So I think if we're going this direction, the code would be the referral note low-ink code we had.
Actually, what I can do is we've got 2 draft motions for each of these. We could actually go through that and talk about what they might look like, because there's a lot of stuff in here, right, that we don't need to go on. But
and most of that, so I guess going back to the top, it was describing the sorts of things it would offer, and I can see there, you know, social history like tobacco use, family support, or cognitive status. That to me doesn't seem too out of the bounds of what we're trying to use it for in this. So that its intent is to include not only laboratory findings, but also some more general observations things. So that's where I was just sort of pointing towards.
Yeah.
But you're right. Going through the what characteristics are and what options we have is.
We can probably go through a few of these. One of the things we brought up was the category. There wasn't necessarily a suitable code. I mean, category here is optional, right? So we don't have to provide it. But just looking about the preferred category codes for this, this was just one of the points that was brought up in the discussion. So you've got social history, vital signs, imaging, laboratory, procedure, survey, exam, therapy, and activity. Now, we're not constrained to this. This is just preferred. We could have our own. We also don't have to provide it. But that's just give an indication of what the preferred value set is for the category.
See, Dan, I would probably think the opposite. I would say that notes don't fit into the category of observation for me, but that's just my initial thoughts.
Yeah, and that's that pro and cons we're looking at. So it doesn't quite fit, but it can fit. I think is potentially the thing. It's not an obvious fit, but it can fit. Right?
Yeah, I guess. What would be the reasons for us to deviate from the standard, the US standard? I guess is probably what I'm interested in. But a lot of this for me, when I start developing against it, that's when I have stronger opinions. But yeah, exactly. So yeah.
So what I might do, just to save us having to go through all of those, we'll see if I can. I just got to jump out of this.
But the observation we were proposed here would be as simple as the code is set and the value is set to string, and everything else is really not. You probably need to have a date timestamp, of course, but the key points would be the code, the value. Code is referral note, value is string, category may be blank because there's not a good choice, and everything else would be not there or defaulted. Like dates, of course, would be set.
So this is just a draft sort of helper proposal. This is by no means what we have to take, just to encourage discussion.
Yeah.
So this, if we are thinking observation, this is probably what we would look at. So we'd set the code to referral note. We'd make the subject mandatory and reference an AU core patient. We could set the focus. We make the focus mandatory and reference back to the imaging request or pathology requests that it applies to. And then we would make the value string mandatory, right? Which is where the actual text note would go. Is there anything else potentially we would look at for that? Or would that be pretty much what we're looking at?
Yeah, I don't know whether we would put focus in, to be honest, because then we'd have circular reference.
Yeah, we would. Yeah. So we could drop that out, but that's an indication how we could use it. But yeah, right, it would create a circular reference, so it might create more problems than it solves. To have a look at if we were using document reference, this might be what we do, where we constrain the type to be a referral note. We'd make the subject mandatory, and it would be the AU core patient. So now this is where we get into the fact that this is a generic document reference that can reference any type of document. So we would make the document reference content attachment mandatory. So what that's saying is that, well, you have to provide an attachment. We would constrain the attachment content type to text plain. So you can't attach a PDF, you can't attach a JPEG. For R1, right? Obviously, we can remove that constraint at any time, but for R1, we don't want anything that's not text. And then we would have to make the content attachment data mandatory to ensure that that content is provided in line in base 64. It doesn't go and reference the document sitting somewhere else on the server or somewhere else. It would be included in the resource as base 64 encoded data. So that's that additional complexity here about dealing with a document reference. It's really set up to reference a document of any type. We want to lock it down and say, look, we only care about text. This is only a way to hold text narrative of the clinical note. So this sort of shows the difference in the complexity between the two. Does anyone else want to go into any of this in more detail or have questions about any of the specific elements or
does plain text imply ASCII or UF8 in any way?
I'm not sure about the encoding, because when you're doing the base 64 encoding, you need to specify that. So there may be something else. I wasn't actually entirely sure how that was specified about the encoding format. But this would be the intent too. We can fine tune this if this was the intent we wanted to go to. Do we think we're in a position where we just do a poll, like this isn't a vote, this is just to get a feeling of the members of the group about which one they would prefer? So a non-binding poll. Are we happy to launch that? Does anyone want to discuss this further before we go into that or raise any observations they have on this? Well, how about I launch that poll? Launch that poll. So this is non-binding. This is just to get a feel for people on the call about where their preference lies. And please, yeah, if you don't know, say I'm unsure.
Preferred options.
I think I tend to want towards Zoran's point in the chat that observation is an event that occurs, is a clinical event that occurs, which has a result. Whereas a note is something that's just a piece of text that somebody wrote down as a it's not an observation. I think it's probably
No, it's in fire. That's not it's not as restrictive as that.
Right,
so
right.
you don't need to have a measurement with an observation. An observation can be something that patient's a non-smoker. It could be that you could have a textual description of patient has told me they've got a family history of hypertension. Any of those could be an observation.
Could be the macroscopic description of a histology thing. It can be text. It can be comment. It can be. We in pathology we use observations all over the place for text.
And then if you really want to confuse it, then you can bring in, conditions and whether you represent something as a condition versus an observation. It gets painful.
Adrian, what would your radiology V2 messages use to actually give you the radiology report text? I suggest it's an observation.
Sorry, how do you mean?
So when you output a V2 radiology report, like blah, 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 blah.
Yeah.
Well, what's the blah, 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 blah in?
Oh, it depends. But yeah, often it's a text representation of HTML or formatted text.
But what segment does it go in a V2 message?
Well, it goes into the OBX5, right?
Which is an observation.
Observation, yeah. Right.
Your radiology report is an observation.
Yes. But yeah.
Zora?
I think the doc is, yeah.
I'm happy with simplicity to adopt observation. I don't have a problem with that. But I guess to me, the natural fit, observation is not natural fit, because observation is really about something from a workflow point of view, something which has happened. Yes, I can use that to represent result. I can use to represent diagnostic report. But on the other hand, the purpose of request is to propose some plan, something which is going to happen in future. So irrespective of what data we have within each of the resources, from the event perspective, from the intent perspective, I guess service request is one thing and event is different thing from the workflow perspective. So that's really my kind of concern. That's worthwhile.
But I think you're mixing up two completely different things. Because you already will have a series of observations attached to the service request. You're going to have that as the clinical context, right? So given you're asking for something, then you're packaging up a set of clinical context that is appropriate for the context of that service request. Some of them will be observations. Some of them may be conditions. Some of them may be devices. So you might have something like an implantable device as part of your clinical context. So all of that is supporting information. So the supporting information is a very broad kind of set of things that are not only representing events, but representing a whole manifest of things that are needed to support the fulfillment of the service request in an appropriately sound, reliable, kind of way. What we're kind of attempting to do is walk a fine line between those pieces of context which have been fully bound and are known in a structured fashion. So for instance, we may say, especially obviously for imaging, we absolutely want everyone to know that including a device as supporting information that relates to this patient is actually everyone, you have to expect this, it may turn up when you're doing imaging requests. Whereas we get this kind of leftover set, which is got a whole bunch of stuff. We are not in a position to formulate that into a structured form at the moment, but we still need to carry it. And it's got to be in a way which is very flexible and open for the filler to interpret. And our lowest common denominator is text. And so at the moment, that's really what we're talking about is what are we going to use to carry that, given we've already talked about various observations that we've agreed are a structured representation of certain things. So it's not really an issue of event patterns versus request patterns.
So supporting information is really capturing various anticipated piece of.
No, it's not anticipated. Like you may have a 25-year of history of hypertension. It's not anticipating you will have hypertension in the future. It's saying, here is a history of hypertension that this patient has had. You may have information about, for instance, 20 years ago, this patient had a liver transplant, and you might include that as supporting information, liver transplant. And it's not saying, I think they're going to have another one. I anticipate. You're not anticipating its impact. Simply saying, from what I know, I believe that this kind of material will have influence on the delivery, the fulfillment of this service that I'm requesting.
Right. So why would you do that as opposed to clinical note, putting all this information in clinical note?
Sorry? That's exactly what we're talking about. We're talking about things that this all goes in supporting information in a service request. Some of that supporting information, it's a list of n things, which is in effect unbound. So we're now talking about how do we create things that are structured and bound that we all agree upon, but how do we support other? Because we have to support other. There are things that the placer wants to have carried with the service request to influence or to provide context to the fulfillment.
Yeah, just jumping ahead a little bit. So the clinical context in whatever resource type it is, whether it's observation, document reference, or something else, would be referenced through supporting info from diagnostic request. And we've currently got pregnancy status in there, supporting info. In the future, we might have adverse reaction risk summary, we might have problem diagnostic summary, we might have other things, all referenced as supporting info from the diagnostic request. So we're only talking here about clinical context and what FHIR resource clinical context becomes, right? That's all, not about how it's managed in supporting info. No?
Yeah, I was just going to clarify what Andy was saying then, like in terms of clinical context, it's like in terms of a medical device, clinically you need to know exactly, if it's been implanted, you need to know specific details about where that device is in the body, when it was implanted, how big it is, those sorts of things. But clinical context is in terms of it being open and as a text-based interpretation, could be like, a child that's broken their arm and you're wanting to verify the location of that break when you're doing the radiology image. So it's I know that at this point we're trying to understand what the fire resource would be, but I think that we're talking about lots of different concepts and placing them in different places where they may not necessarily be appropriate. Does that make sense?
You can certainly put stuff in clinical context as string, which would be inappropriate. But I mean, we're identifying items that have high value, like medical devices, and it's going to have its own.
That would have its own, yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
And of course, people could do naughty things, like instead of filling in the form about the implanted device, they could just go to clinical notes and goes, this person has an implanted device in their left, in their stomach or something. And it'd be like, well, you should have told us that in the device form, not just written it here, but we can't stop you doing that.
Well, it'd be part of, well, I'd imagine it'd be part of, eventually it'll be part of that service request. So this is something that's a risk that you need to know about when you're doing an image that the radiographer needs to see and anticipate, but it doesn't actually relate to the clinical context in which the request was actually, or the placer was actually placing that request, if that makes sense. It's part of their medical history and their background.
Well, this clinical context is per request, right? So
Yes.
it's not, we're not extracting it from your clinical system. We're literally giving you a text box and saying, what do you want to tell us?
Exactly. Yeah.
Whereas the others, like the other things, probably would be extracted from your EIS, but you would be presented to you like, do you want to send this with this request? And you can say, no,
Yes.
I don't.
Yeah, exactly. So we need to exclude all that structured document that would be there anyway out of the clinical system. Like the medical history, the hypertension, all of that sort of stuff is not what we're looking for here, right?
Well, I mean, that's not, I don't know whether that's necessarily true in all cases. So for instance, this is our only, the supporting information is the only place we can carry this supporting information. Right? There is nothing else to, no other buckets to put this in. So we've got to decide, how are we going to set up these buckets so that when a filler receives this set of buckets, they actually know what to do with them. And we've kind of chosen some kind of predefined buckets, but we've left this kind of, what about other things that either should never go in a structured bucket or should possibly in future go in a structured bucket, but we're not ready yet. And we somehow have to figure out how to carry this in a way which is not confusing and potentially a clinical issue in its interpretation at the filler's end.
Can I read out a comment that's in the chat? Because I think it's relevant.
Yep.
So someone's commented, I do see a trend here for some persons to skew the decision-making to simple implementation choices here, possibly because that is how they have already chosen to develop something. Standards should be about best choices now and providing the best pathway for future requirements and capabilities. Often this requires more than simplicity for now approach, as this often introduces the need to introduce additional complexity in the future because now you also have backward compatibility considerations. You only have to look at the history of V2 evolution to see the similarities for this. I think it's a fair comment. And I personally don't think we're stopping future innovation. Like we have a mandate from the clinical group that they want a string clinical note, and we're supporting that. We absolutely can see the future where we come back and make a decision that you can send images, Word documents, whatever. But and you can do that around the standard now without it being standardized. But if we're going to send Word documents between us all, it has to come back here and be standardized, right? So we could have a different conversation now and say, let's include Word documents, right? And we could have that conversation, but we're not, and we're not avoiding that in the future we'll have that conversation. And does this decision, I guess it's a fair point Does this decision now rule out that future? Are we making the future harder now because we use observation instead of document reference? I think it's a very valid point, and I think we are on. I think it's the key point, to be honest.
Well, yeah, I'd be interested if anyone saw that this was constraining by choosing the observation, taking into account the obviously intention to add arbitrary attachments into it in R5.
There's nothing stopping closed systems on top of this standard, outside of the standard, sending a Word document to each other and do it however they like. They might use document reference. If we get to a point where we go, no, this is a thing that we have to standardize, we're all going to use across the industry, we're going to be back here and we're going to decide how to do it. And I would suppose we probably bring document reference in and we do it that way. But you're going to have everyone support it too. Just like, it's really a question like, are we blocking the future on this decision?
I'm going to end the poll. Sorry, just to, it is a split decision. There is no clear winner at this point. We had 7 for document reference, plus 1 in the chat, which was 8. We had 6 for observation. We had 1 for other and 12 unsure. Like, I don't think that's a clear winner either way. It's just a couple of votes. So we're pretty much.
It's a clear winner for unsure.
Yeah, it's clear winner for unsure. Actually, that's completely right. I think that's where we all are at.
Can we run the poll again?
Sorry, what was that, Chris?
Can we run the poll again after we've had the discussion?
Yeah, we can definitely run it again. Sorry, Steph, did you capture those numbers just before I So it was 7 document reference plus 1 in the chat was 8, 6 for observation, 1 for other, and 12 for unsure. Did anyone want to say what that other was? But anyway, I'm happy to. We can launch the poll again now. There's been more chat.
This is Chris's conclave approach.
It's fine.
Do we have a puff
into a big fire?
Do we have puffs of smoke?
Well, relaunch it now to see if anyone's after that conversation. If anyone's been swayed one way or the other. Maybe we'll have to flip a coin at the end of this. I'll just give that another 5 seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. 6 for document reference plus 1 in the chat was 7. 6 for observation. 10 for unsure. So unsure is still a winner. So we've got option here is we can park it, have further discussion in the in Confluence and the like, or we can make a motion one way or the other and see whether we get support for that. Open to the TDG, where we go next.
Well, given it's 50-50, then whoever puts the motion forward is likely to succeed.
Correct.
So I'll put the motion forward to say that we should support, we should put the unstructured clinical context into a constrained observation.
Did you want to use any of this as a guide for that motion?
I just want to get rid of the observation focus as a mandatory.
So you would propose this with the removal of focus?
Yep.
Okay.
Chris, I will second that motion.
So we've got a second. I will launch a poll. If you don't agree with it, vote negative. And if you are happy to move forward with this, vote positive. If you're unsure, abstain. So I will launch a poll. Vote for the current motion. Okay, you should see. All right, I'll end that poll in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. We do not have a majority. We've got 7 affirmative. We've got 6 negative plus 1 in the chat, which is 7 negative and 12 abstain. So we have no majority. So we're at a pass.
I don't know whether we start. Do we go down and talk about what it would take to send Word documents around? Like, do we explore the thing that I feel people are concerned we're blocking, or?
We certainly are not going to be sending Word documents.
But I'm wondering whether we need to have that discussion so people can see the arguments why we're so far from that.
Yeah, you can send me a PDF, but definitely not a Word document, Angus.
PDF, yeah.
Yeah.
And what a clinical system is going to pop up an editor where you write a clinical note and then convert it into a PDF. I think PDFs and Word documents aren't referral notes. They're like other things. They're other things.
Yeah.
I've got this report from the cardiologist and I want to give it to you with the request.
So I wouldn't expect you to send me a note in a PDF. I'd expect that to be some sort of attachment or I don't know if how that gets coded or if that's possible, but
Yeah, I struggle with when is a referral note anything but text. Like maybe it can be formatted. Maybe that's why you're putting in a Word document so you can put dot points and headings and things. I'm struggling with the use case. I feel like the other attachments, which aren't just string, are not referral notes. They're like the report from the cardiologist, this report I found somewhere else, there's something that someone sent me about the patient. I want to give that to you as well. They're not referral notes. They're attachments. And I can see a future where we add document reference to provide attachments of type PDF, Word, whatever you want to list it is. But is it a referral note?
Isn't that coded though in the resource? Don't you know what it is by the light code that's provided?
Yeah, it'd be something else. It'd be like attachment, right? It's still supporting information. It's still in the context of this is supporting information for this request, and this PDF thing, which I really don't know what it is, but it's an attachment, right? But that's separate to this is a referral note. This is what I want to write with my own hands to tell you with this request, not what I'm passing to you that I got from someone else.
But at the end of the day, we're talking about the transport mechanism, right? The actual display and how it's used by a user is completely different.
Well,
right?
they're not.
And I have similar problems with anything that is a web-based application, being able to copy and paste from Outlook or Word or anything else that introduces characters that may or may not be supported by another system. Right, so I still have the same issues about UTF-8 or UTF-16, extended ASCII or not extended ASCII. All those things have to be addressed anyway, even if you say it's string.
Well, if you have to put in an observation as a string, then you can't send me anything but string.
What I'm saying is, aside from the transport mechanism, dealing with the actual content is still got a whole range of other issues from an implementation point of view in terms of building your application. Whereas if you know it's a PDF, okay, if I basically got to have something that can view a PDF. Most browsers can. Most don't support viewing Word documents, and that's not recommended by probably anybody. They might, but they might actually display RTFs instead. So there are lots of things about here, things about discussions around here about what document types you want to support in future and how and all the other bits. But they're all implementation about application side, not about transport mechanism.
But what we choose in the transport is actually impacting on what's going to happen at the endpoint. So for instance, if we did a PDF, I know of at least one lab currently who analyzes the data, analyzes the text within the clinical note for various purposes. And, if you're going to be sending it as a PDF, that puts an awful load on them to somehow be responsible for putting that back into text.
But again, that's an implementation concern, right? For a given situation with a given client with a given system. And
Well,
so
but this whole thing's about implementation.
whether I put it in whether I use a document reference to do that, it just means is for that implementation with that client, I can only do these things.
Sorry, can I just confirm I'm just trying to work out what the concern is here. Is it the encoding of the request, or is it the encoding of the document?
So our mandate is to send a string clinical note, and we are toying with the how do we do that today that's going to make it more flexible for the future is where I think a lot of concern lies. And so there's a concern that if you use observation, we're limited to string, which suits us today, but that observation ain't going to work tomorrow when someone decides they want to send something that isn't string. And if we use document reference, it tomorrow could be fairly simple to change the MIME type and say, now this referral note is actually a PDF or RTF or whatever it wants to be, as opposed to in the future creating still having your observation string, but now creating a document reference of type referral note, which is going to have the RTF in it. You know, you could say, you know, so let's say we're 5 years in the future, we chose the observation, and now we're back here 5 years later, and we're like, the mandate is we now have to send PDFs or RTF to each other, right? That's what the industry wants. And we'd go, oh, okay, can we squeeze it in the observation? Oh, no. Why did they pick observation? Maybe we should have picked document reference, because now we're going to have to pick document reference to send this PDF. I think that's the conundrum we're struggling with. Is the future us in 5 years going to curse ourselves because we chose observation and now have to use document reference in order to suffice the requirement to send, say, RTF?
Yeah.
And
my simple view would be is, what's the way we can choose right now that gives us a roadmap that we could potentially follow if in future we want to do additional things to what we know about today?
I'd argue we're very bad at predicting the future and keeping it simple.
But we do have some history about what's happened with, you know, HL7v2, right? And we know about what's happening with technology and how, you know, web applications have changed from the green screens that we had in the past and all those other things. We do have
hasn't changed for all of us.
But we have a sort of, you know, an idea about, you know, how the world has changed.
We also have the V3 HL7 experience, which tried to tried to plan everything out from the beginning and horribly failed. Right?
I think especially looking to PDF as our future for this kind of stuff. If anything, you know, what we're struggling with is things that will become structured in future, not even less structured than text. So there's a number of things I think we will get broad agreement that it needs to be computable as clinical context, because there's an automation we want to put in place. So I think it's less likely that we would go to a more kind of PDF style than we would be transitioning to something more structured style.
Let's go. Let's not even say it's a document. Let's say it's a capture of some voice, right? So what I'm saying is we already know the technologies are there to basically convert text, you know, speech to text and all sorts of things. Whereas there's already technology there to read a document, pick out the pieces out of it. So there are all AI tools now. So, you know, the future about being able to do and reduce what we actually have to program for is already there.
Does observation?
It's there today in terms of the capability, right? So we're not saying we need to use it today, but if we go down a path where we say, oh, let's not worry about that now, we close the door, and now 3 or 4 years down the track, we're going, oh, we want to do these things. Oh, now we have to reinvent the send. Oh, but we've got our old applications that do this. So now I have to change how all these applications, because they now have to pack this into a different place to transport it.
That's the thing we outlined with both these approaches, that it's unclear there is any roadblock in future for either. You know, in 5 years' time, it's pretty clear we will be more in the.
You know, at the end of the day, there's a bunch of us. We've all got different opinions, and we've voted, and those opinions basically haven't changed in the whole discussion at this point. From what I can see, the numbers are pretty much where they were.
Yeah.
So all we have to do is the people who aren't sure have to go somewhere. So maybe you need to remove the choices of unsure and get a real get them to sit on the, not sit on the fence.
Well, in a vote, there's always abstain. So people that are uncomfortable making decisions can always abstain. So I think the only option now, we've only got a few minutes left in this meeting, is to actually, there has been very little contribution to the Confluence page. That page was set up so we could discuss and bring up topics. I don't know whether that's not the right mechanism, whether we have a Zulip chat or something like that to further flesh this out between meetings. Happy for, and maybe we get some broader input from that, from the broader community, if we do something like Zulip. Do we think that's the next step for this, is do that, see if we can get some more consensus through a asynchronous forum, and bring it back? Because I can't see us resolving this in the next 5 minutes. Open to any suggestions about where we go next.
You could do a poll on Zulip. I don't know.
Well, how about when we do that? We try that approach. I'll post something on Zulip. I'll reference our Confluence page. Continue the discussion there. See if we can come around to a decision. If we can't, we can't. That's right. We'll say we couldn't get a decision. Just noting that we've only got 5 minutes, I'm going to jump ahead here to next for ballot for comment. So we are getting close to ballot for comment. Sorry, ballot for working standard. The ballot for working standard will go out in August. So this will be for our R1 publication of eRequesting. So between now and then, we don't have much time to get any remaining content in the IG. So just talking to that, we need to complete the normative changes proposed for eRequesting R1. So that doesn't happen in ballot. So what we've got to do is we've got to get a position of a complete eRequesting to take to ballot for working standard. And then we're getting feedback on that and voting on it through the ballot for working standard. So there is the Spark testing event, which we talked about earlier in this meeting, which will be our opportunity to test what we've got in there, make sure it's fit for purpose. We have to do Australian Fire Maturity Model assessment to review the IG artifacts. All of our IG artifacts are currently at draft 0. They need to be at AFMM 1 in order to go to ballot. We need to complete a review of our variance statement from AU Base and AU Core. We need to complete all the informative and editorial changes for eRequesting R1, and then we do our ballot prep and balloting. So just talking about the maturity model, that's something we have to bring all the artifacts to the TDG and have a vote to say that they're going to be at FMM 1, which is the one there. So there's no warnings, no errors. The key thing here is the responsible work group has indicated they consider the artifacts substantially complete and ready for implementation. So we have to do an assessment of that as part of the TDG. So we're currently at draft 0. Everything is draft. We need to move everything to AFMM 1. And what that looks like at a timeline moving forward. So we have the 22nd of May and the 5th of June to do normative content. So that's profiles and structured content in the IG. We only got 2 meetings. Then we really need to move into the informative content, all the supporting information that's in the IG to support implementation. Then we've got the Spark testing event, 24th of June. Following that, we'll look to get any feedback from testing and do our AFMM review and approval, as well as the variance statement. And then really the 17th of July is our last meeting for any changes. And the meeting prior to ballot will be a ballot process and IG review before the ballot gets published on the 4th of August and balloting opens on 11th of August. So, like I said, not a lot of time there. We won't go into this in any detail, but these are all the things we've already done. And we did have this vote in the 27th of March, or poll about what we wanted to focus on next. We've been focusing here on clinical context, which is that first one. I'd be interested for anyone to call out now anything on this that they think is an absolute priority for one of the next 2 meetings. If anyone's got specific opinions on something that we need to call out in the next 2 meetings to get things across. Obviously, we've still got clinical context to resolve, but any of these others, are there any strong opinions on what's next? The co-chairs will discuss about what we think is probably appropriate, but if anyone's got something they think we absolutely have to do in the next 2 meetings to get into the ballot, now's a great chance to hear that opinion. Otherwise, we'll continue to use this as a guide, but we won't get through much of this, and given there's only 2 meetings and we haven't resolved clinical context yet. Sorry, Zoran, was that?
I guess I can see tokens, barcodes, QR codes is probably going to be left off for R1. Even though we've written some content for it, I think it's just too much to squeeze in. I think it's kind of, if anything, we're at a good line where we can say we've really focused on the clinical model, if you will. We haven't really done the cross-organization exchange part, like claiming. So third and fourth, we haven't really done, and we're certainly not going to do it in 2 weeks.
Yeah. And I think that to get to a national agreement on some of those things would be complex, and but probably, especially where we are now, a step too far for R1. But it means that we would have the data models and the basic interactions that then can be used to develop implementations in your own ecosystems. Okay, well, that brings us to the end. Like I said, next 2 meetings, trying to get some more normative content through. Then we've got to shift gears into informative content or supporting information in the IG, doing our reviews and getting approvals for ballot and prep for ballot. So that's where we're at. Thanks, everyone. It was a great discussion today. We didn't get there, but I'm sure we will. And I'll post something on Zoom for us to continue the conversation. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Michael.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.